It's the Beatles. The Fab Four: John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr. The band that took Elvis's crown of being the most transcendently popular music act, a crown later held by artists like Michael Jackson and Madonna. The leaders of the British invasion. The quartet that is to date the most successful band with a total of 183 million certified albums sold, and cited by almost every band around during their prime and after as a source of inspiration. It's Led Zeppelin. When I think of a rock band, I think of Led Zeppelin. Known as the biggest band in the world at the height of their success, Led Zeppelin would come to embody almost all of the tropes we've come to love. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll could have been the tagline for a Led Zeppelin movie if one ever came out. But just knowing them as such would undermine the fact that Led Zeppelin was one of the most talented bands to come out of a decade when rock was unquestionably the ascendant form of music. And with a nice 111 million albums sold, they're not doing too shabby in that department either. It's the Beatles, transforming themselves from the most successful boy band of all time, whose catchy lyrics and melodies warm their way inside every teenage girl's hearts, into the most innovative, creative, and important voices of their generation. It's Led Zeppelin. Arriving like a shooting star, whose lyrics, sound, and technical prowess allow them to not only create some of the hardest hard rock songs of all time, but to also experiment away from their blues-inspired origins to some of the most experimental rock music of its time. It's the most iconic band of the 60s versus the most iconic band of the 70s. I'm your host, BenAF, and this is the first ever Great Debate, the Beatles versus Led Zeppelin edition. Now before we can get into comparing both these bands, we have to set categories of which to compare them with. But don't worry, your boy already thought of that and came prepared. I've come up with a highly scientific, peer-reviewed, rigorously tested, and entirely made-up method of choosing 5 different categories and awarding points in each one to determine a winner. The categories are: image, how well do they present themselves? Commercial impact/success, just how good were they at selling their art? Body of work, how well do their albums hold up? Uniqueness, will we ever see them again? Legacy, just how much do they matter in the grand scheme of things? Having those guidelines set, let's get down to the real nitty-gritty. The early look of the Beatles is iconic. The way the band revamped themselves from an unorganized group of guys your parents would have forbidden you to see, to a synchronized, cohesive look that screams boy next door, with professional attire is nothing short of marketing genius. Another brilliant idea was making each album in itself a piece of art. I would argue that each album could be hung up and presented by themselves as an art collection. Simply put, every way the Beatles chose to present themselves was nothing short of innovative, and that's before becoming spokespersons for an entire counterculture movement. With the release of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, the Beatles signified their seismic shift from a group of insanely talented musicians being confined to the limits of their genre, into artists whose only limitations seemed to be the limitations of music itself. Gone were the suits and in were the weird military-esque costumes, and from there, each Beatle would mature into their own look, style, and eventually into separate musicians. Led Zeppelin, on the other hand, oozed fuck you swagger from the get-go. Nothing about them seemed like a put-upon or an act. When Led Zeppelin wore an outfit, it's because they thought it looked cool. When Zeppelin released an album, you knew what you were getting was 40 plus minutes of what Led Zeppelin thought sounded good. They weren't pretenders or phonies. Even to the point of fault, they were always Led Zeppelin. For me, they're 2 different philosophies that lead to the same place. So the deciding factor is this. Do you prefer when your significant other gets all dressed up real fancy, or do you prefer when they just go in some comfortable attire? I know which one I prefer. Give it the natural look all day. Point to Led Zeppelin. Saying that Led Zeppelin moved records would be the understatement of the century. When Led Zeppelin was on top, they were the kings of rock. Their best-selling album was Led Zeppelin 4, with a claimed total of 37 million records and a total of 32 million certified sales. Both are an astonishing amount back then, but now seem inconceivable. For perspective, the best-selling album of the 21st century was Adele's 21, which sold about 10 million physical albums in 2 years. Led Zeppelin would go on to sell 200 to 300 million records, with 111.5 million of those being certified, which ranks them 5th all-time of best-selling artists. But sadly for Led Zeppelin, they're going against number 1 on that list. The Beatles were a phenomenon of which the likes had only been seen once before and really only done a few times after. Their stardom transcended music, and it reflected in their sales. Like Zeppelin, their creative and commercial peaks coincided with Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, sold a total of 32 million albums, with 19 million of those having been certified. Overall, the Beatles have a total of 500 to 600 million record sales, with 283.8 million of those being certified. There's no argument here. There's just cold hard empirical facts. This point goes to the Beatles. I can honestly let the Beatles and Led Zeppelin's discographies speak for themselves, but that's not how we do things around here. Here at BenAF HQ, we've patented a totally brand new way to rate, well, anything, by using a star system. But not just any star system, the BenAF star system. Here's how it goes. The first 3 stars are awarded based on meeting a certain criteria for music. The criteria goes as follows. Quality. Does it sound good? Noteworthiness. Is it memorable? Relatability. Does the song resonate in a meaningful way? If a song meets all 3 criteria, it gets to move on to the last 2 categories, which have to do with universal appeal. Is it an all-time great within its respective genre? Is it one of the greatest songs ever? The Beatles released 13 studio albums, of which contain 180 songs, which I have gone through and personally rated all of. Here are the results. As you can see, some of the ratings are low for a traditional scoring system, but keep in mind, if I award a star, it's an endorsement from me that a song or album is at least worth listening to. Here's a good way to scale it. 0 to 1 is most music. We could kind of compare it to a typical girl. 1 to 2 means it's a good album. It's not like every other girl. 2 to 3 means it's a great album. It's wifey material. It meets all 3 criteria. 3 to 4 is truly a classic. It's the you're dealing with something truly special, my friend girl. And 4 to 5 is very rare territory, an undisputed all-time classic. It's the unicorn girl. The one that when you meet her, you lock her down. Because those kind of girls don't grow on trees. So now that we've got that long-ass explanation out of the way, let's dive into the numbers. The Beatles have 1 undisputed classic, 8 genre classics, and 4 great albums for a score of 3.88. Again, it may look low, but I would put this score on a GPA type scale where getting anywhere close to a 4 actually means something special. Now let's look at Led Zeppelin's records. That's going to equal 1 undisputed classic, 5 genre classics, and 2 great albums for a total score of 3.31. Well, the math doesn't lie, folks. If you want to go check over my work and see how every song was rated, I'll upload my results on a Google Doc or something. But 3.88 is larger than 3.31. Give a point to the Beatles. In any profession you can think of, there's always titans of the industry that people aspire to emulate. For example, in the business world, the late great CEO of General Electric, Neutron Jack Welch, is one of those people. He transformed General Electric from a company worth $12 billion in 1981, who while dabbling in many fields, were known mostly for electrical appliances, into an international conglomerate that dabbles in aviation, healthcare, and finances, just to name a few things, and worth $410 billion when he retired in 2001. How'd he do it? 2 main ways. He made sure any industry that GE was a part of, or heading into, would be the top or second company, and also by making sure that he was maximizing the work of people under him. He wasn't nicknamed Neutron Jack for no reason. As a strategy, he would make surprise visits to GE plants and offices, and if you weren't justifying your paycheck, you were gone. If this sounds familiar, the current Jack Welch is Jeff Bezos, who through unconventional means has turned a company that sells books online to the most terrifying behemoth of a company that literally threatens any industry it even jokes about stepping into. Bands work in the same way. When the Beatles broke out in 1962, they helped to define what rock music was and was going to become as well, which is why so many artists credit them with being the inspiration for them even wanting to pick up an instrument. But like the saying goes, they were often replicated but never duplicated. While many bands tried, I'm looking at you, Oasis, no one was ever able to replicate the consistent flow of brilliance the Beatles were able to achieve. Same goes for Led Zeppelin. It's hard to imagine what hard rock would sound like in a world where Led Zeppelin didn't exist. Before Zeppelin took over as the biggest band in the world, hard rock music's only representation in the mainstream was The who while helping to bring louder, more brash music to the mainstream, are pretty tame compared to what would come next. Take Zeppelin's track Safari Song, for example. This is Zeppelin in their prime. The drums and guitar working in tandem with Plant's vocals is really what Zeppelin is all about. Nothing sounded like them at the time, and still doesn't to this very day. What do you mean that isn't Led Zeppelin? Who the fuck are Greta Van Fleet? When did this happen? 2012? Do you mean to tell me there's a band that was pretty much able to recreate what Zeppelin did for a modern audience? Well, fuck me. I guess the point goes to the Beatles. Like I said in the previous category, it's hard to imagine hard rock in a world without Led Zeppelin. They are the quintessential rock band. Their talent coupled with their style was so unique and so brash, it was impossible to copy back then, and with one notable exception, never has been. But the same attitude that made them so beloved by their fans is why at the time staunch stuck-up critics like the ones at the Rolling Stone magazine couldn't stand them when they first came out. It's like how world-famous movie critic Roger Ebert gave a classic like Alien a middling review. He just couldn't get past it being a horror movie. And like Ebert, the music critics simply didn't get Zeppelin's hard rock style. And just like how Roger Ebert had the internet scrub his review and replace it with his re-reviews, music critics now hail Led Zeppelin as pioneers of an entire genre. That being said, it's hard to imagine music, period, without the Beatles. Not only has the sound of every musician been changed by them, but the way that music is constructed and even listened to was impacted by them. When did bands start writing their own songs as opposed to hiring others to do it for them? That's the Beatles. Why do people primarily buy albums as opposed to singles? That's the Beatles. Before them, albums were just a collection of singles recorded around the same time. But the Beatles thought that albums themselves should have a theme, not just the singles. That subtle change is why you have artists who don't even release singles anymore, which was unimaginable pre-Beatles. I'm not even going to discuss how they changed how music sounds, because this video is already long enough. But think of it like this. Just like how there was a world pre-internet and a world post-internet, there was a world pre-Beatles and post-Beatles. And as big as Led Zeppelin were, I can't say the same. Point to the Beatles, the winners of the inaugural Great Debate. So thanks for watching my first ever attempt at a scripted video. I appreciate you listening to my thoughts on the subject. If you could hit that subscribe button, that would be cool. I want to take over my main rival, my friend Jamie, who has 19 subscribers now. So if I could pass her, that'd be pretty cool. Yeah. But thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next time.